Go ahead and pull up my screen. And I have to apologize in advance. I'm battling a bit of a cold today, so I'm hoping my voice holds out. And if I mute myself suddenly, it's just so that you don't have to listen to me coughing. But I'll do my best to get through this, and at least in this virtual setting, I don't have to project too much. All right, so the topic that I was asked to present on today is the cyber threat landscape and engineering mitigations for grid-forming inverters. I'm going to give a little bit of background to motivate why we care about cybersecurity for grid-forming inverters, and then talk a little bit about the threat landscape and real-world events. And then I will close with some cyber-informed engineering solutions to help mitigate risks associated with these devices. So why do we care about this? None of this should be a surprise, but obviously as we modernize the electric grid, in any future that we consider, there's going to be more digital pieces that are part of the grid. And that's for enhanced dispatchability, for wide-scale sensing, to use artificial intelligence in ways that can help enhance performance, to give customers increased control over their energy usage and bills, to help asset owners and operators better manage their existing assets, for predictive maintenance, for more accurate forecasts, for better supply chain management. All of these things that we're seeing now, that there are increased digital controls associated here. We're also seeing that there is an increase in renewable resources and inverter-based resources being used on the grid across the United States. So the numbers that I've highlighted here are electricity generation in kilowatt hours on the left-hand side. And then I've put energy storage here in capacity on the right-hand side. It's a little bit hard to compare these two just because on the one hand with storage, we don't necessarily have information about all of the charge and discharge cycles. So we really have this capacity measurement that is the best measurement we have of how much we're seeing on the grid. But it doesn't really matter which one of these you look at. We can see that the components of inverter-based resources are strongly growing. So here on the left, as we look at the total energy mix, the green here is renewables. So we can see that that's on an upward trend. And then as we break down that renewables piece of it, the wind and solar are some of the most quickly growing pieces there. Now, again, not all inverter-based resources are going to be grid-forming inverters, but at least in some of these EIA type of data sources, that's kind of one of the best measurements that we have for what the trends are here. Looking forward, doesn't really matter. There's a bunch of different factors that go into predicting what these will look like in the future, but almost all of them have wind and solar increasing over the next 20 years, and coal, of course, being the one that's on the highest point of decline. I do like to call out hybrid power plants here just because I think it's an interesting measure of how we are deploying inverter-based resources. So this study by Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory looks at hybrid plants that have over 1 megawatt of capacity. At the end of 2023, there were 469 plants that had that capacity, which represented 49 gigawatts of generating capacity and was tied to 11.1 gigawatt hours of storage capacity. I think it's interesting to note that the co-located model is more popular than the true hybrid model. So that means that when we have things like solar storage hybrids, those are still behind their own inverters rather than that combined AC power being behind a single inverter, or sorry, that combined DC power being behind a single inverter that's converting to AC. So as we think about where the grid forming capacity is, I think that we're seeing a growth in that across inverter-based resources, but storage is still one of the more popular areas for that to be in. Excuse me. So the kind of alluded to this, but PV plus storage dominates the hybrid plants, although there are other types of hybrids as well, including some fossil fuel hybrids. So things like natural gas plus storage, which I think is kind of interesting. And then we see both for PV storage that most, or at least half of these hybrids, let me think about how to say this correctly. So more storage is in a PV hybrid combination model than it is as standalone storage. And we see this on the PV side too. I think I've got this on the next slide. Maybe not, but the same thing is true for solar. That most solar in interconnection queues is combined with storage rather than being independently just a standalone solar plant. And then just in general, hybrids are also over 50% of the active storage capacity in queues. So I think what this shows is a growing interest in having the ability to smooth out variable resources through the use of hybrids, whether that's even when solar hybrids that have some level of complementarity, or whether it's through something that makes it a little bit more dispatchable, like combining it with a non-renewable resource or combining it with bulk energy storage. And so I think this shows a trend towards wanting to have things that are more dispatchable and more controllable, which in my mind lends itself towards that grid forming inverter, the case for grid forming inverters too. What does all of this mean for cybersecurity? As we see a growth in the number of inverter-based resources, we see a growth in the number of stakeholders. A growth in the number of endpoints. Both of these things can lead to an increase in the attack surface. That's not necessarily to say that they all are necessarily more vulnerable, but just that potential exists. The electrification for loads. Here we see an increase in potential impact as there's, especially as we see more data centers coming online. Along with electrification of household resources. If these types of, when we see an impact to the bulk electric grid, there's a greater potential impact stemming from that with the greater electrification. Excuse me one moment. All right. Aggregation of DER, again, we see that there's more central points of control, which could be a potential increase in impact from a single point of failure. Increased regulation. This isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, but as we see more regulation, hopefully we're raising the baseline for cybersecurity, but we also know that standards tend to lag behind the state of the art. The digitization of monitoring, control, and the distribution of control, all of these things, we're going to see the explosion of data and need to manage this data appropriately. And then, of course, smarter inverters, which we could also kind of call a proxy for grid forming inverters, more capabilities, that's a larger attack surface, that's more consequences that could come out of this. So when I break down a threat landscape in general, typically when we think about risk, we think about likelihood and consequence. Likelihood is really hard to determine for cyber events just because there's so many different ways that these can be, these can express themselves. And so typically we break down likelihood into threat and vulnerability, and then we keep that consequence piece there too. And we can apply mitigations to each one of these areas that can reduce the overall risk. Threat typically tends to be the hardest place to apply mitigations because we don't have as much control over the threat actors, and consequence tends to be the easier place to apply mitigations because we have more control over the systems and their behaviors and can put mitigating controls in place. The types of threat actors that we're looking at here for grid forming inverters can be anything from internal to external actors, really anything that poses a threat to an organization, and anyone who has access to an organization or to a particular plant. We typically break down threat by intent, capability, and opportunity. So intent is what the attacker is driving to achieve. Often one of these things here on the right, loss, denial, or manipulation of view, control, safety. Capability is really just a proxy for skills and funding. When you hear things like a nation state attacker, we're talking about groups that have the highest capability because they have a lot more skills and resources and people, as well as the funding to work on a particular target for a long time. And then opportunity is access to the target. We can have the most highly skilled threat actors, but if they have no ability to actually reach that end target, then there's not really much of a threat. However, when we talk about systems being air gapped, that's, I think, more of a notional concept than anything that's real at this point. I'd say that there are very few, if any, systems that are truly air gapped in today's modern electric infrastructure. When we talk about how these threat actors are reaching their targets, what is that method of opportunity? We can talk about physical access, cyber access, or transient access. I think the physical access piece is really interesting to consider for inverter-based resources, because as opposed to traditional generating plants that are going to be centrally located and usually gated, often guarded, when we look at the distribution of inverter-based resources and where they have to be located geographically to get access to that resource, there's not usually as much physical protection. So you can think about like a wind farm that's on leasing land from a farmer. Maybe there's a gate around that farmer's property. Maybe there's a lock on the wind turbine itself, but those are both things that can usually be easily cut. And then you have access to that wind plant controls and could potentially plug in a device right there. Cyber access, of course, is the one that we typically think of. There's a variety of different ways that the cyber access could be achieved, whether that's through VPN exploitation, through wireless access points, or through a traditional cyber attack method of pivoting through the enterprise network. And then on the transient access side, it's important here to consider not just the way that the architecture is set up and what's always in place, but also who might have access to these systems for temporary periods of times. For example, maintainers or technicians that are not constantly connected, but may have access points for legitimate business purposes. When we think about what this exposure looks like, there's a lot of things that are kind of perennially exposed. So there's been several trends or several studies done on this, and they all have slightly different scopes. And I don't think it's worth reading too much into exactly what these numbers are. But a 2024 report found over 145,000 internet exposed ICS devices. A 2023 study found over 130,000 solar monitoring services exposed online. This was not necessarily devices. This was more of the like monitoring portals. And just because they were exposed and accessible online doesn't necessarily mean that they're vulnerable or misconfigured. But they did find that some of these exposed services didn't really have protections in place and could be accessed without authentication. This is not limited to inverter-based resources. A 2018 study found exposed HMIs for oil and gas, solar, wind, water, hydroelectric, and biogas plants. And then going back all the way to 2014, a study found 2.2 million unique IPs for ICS devices across the electrical sector. So again, to what extent these exposed points are actually vulnerable is different questions, but I think it opens up a key piece of that threat component, which is the access to the target. The second component of our risk equation was vulnerability. So vulnerability is a weakness which can be exploited by an adversary to gain unauthorized access to or perform unauthorized actions on a system. I think it's important to note that it can be a flaw in either design or implementation. So while we may typically think of things like CVE numbers that point to a flaw in code or a flaw in hardware and the way that it was designed, it can also be a flaw in the implementation. So misconfigurations or not applying proper security around something can be considered a vulnerability as well. We see several trends in the disclosed vulnerabilities related to what I'm calling digital energy infrastructure, but what I primarily mean here is inverter-based resources. Weak credentials are a really common one, whether that's weak requirements for passwords, hard-coded credentials, passwords that can be derived from available information like a serial number, plain text storage or transfer of passwords, or just weak implementation of encryption or authentication that can be broken. We see a lot of this type of practice in place. We also see a lot of web page vulnerabilities, and some of these can be, a lot of them lead to information leaks, but some of them can even lead to arbitrary code execution. So usually this is coming from improper input sanitization, where, for example, when you were asked to input a username using some special characters, you can kind of convince the computer to execute some different code on your behalf, revealing sensitive information or even giving root access to the server on which that web page is running. We see that sometimes these exploits for known vulnerabilities, I don't really know exactly why certain ones are picked up on and kind of gain a lot of momentum, but some of them do. And we see that there's proof of exploit code, like proof of concept, actual code, modules on Metasploit that are developed, example videos that show how to execute this exploit for a vulnerability. And that makes it that much easier for somebody who doesn't really have the experience or knowledge to leverage this vulnerability against exposed systems. Here's a few examples, and I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but of some vulnerabilities that demonstrate these trends. So things like derivable passwords, default admin passwords, hard-coded login passwords, weak passwords, hard-coded credentials. See a lot of these in different devices, and then same thing with this application and the web portals. Operating system command injection, things that allow command injection, things that allow changes to different parameters that can, again, reveal information that an unauthenticated user should not have access to. So that brings us to the third part of our risk triad, which is consequence. There are, of course, a lot of different consequences that can happen from attacking inverter-based resources. I think the most common one here to note is loss of remote monitoring. That's really the thing that we see most often, is blocking access to resources, even if those resources continue to produce power. I would say that the worst case ones, we see a lot of studies or vulnerability reports that claim that if you were to exploit these, you could destabilize the power system. I tend to take most of those with a grain of salt. They usually rely on a lot of assumptions about the way that things are happening that may or may not have validity in the real world. But there's still that potential if an attacker were to gain access to a lot of different systems and be able to perform a coordinated attack, often in combination with a particular event that might already be happening on the power side. So like combining it with a tornado or a hurricane or something that's going through the area. So when we talk about grid forming inverters in particular, most of what I've been talking about can be said for most digital energy infrastructure and any inverter-based resource. But when I think about grid forming inverters, I think about the more complex controls that these devices have, the potentially larger impact that it could have on grid stability, given the increased reliance on their ability to do the grid forming. They may have a higher criticality level in system operations, which means that protecting them should take higher precedence. And then when we think about the consequences, we just want to consider the grid services that these inverters have and the impact if that service is unavailable, or even if that service is maliciously manipulated. And then also consider the scale at which grid forming inverters are installed. If they make up a large, or if they make up a small component of the overall system or subsystem, then taking those inverters out may not have a huge impact on stability, but depending on the context of how they're being used, or if there's a lot of them in place, then that could certainly lead to a larger impact. I do want to touch too on supply chain security. This is a growing area of concern that I think is largely unaddressed for a lot of different inverters. We're seeing growing concerns over untrusted supply chains. We're seeing this from several of our primary nation-state threat actor adversaries, including pro-Russia hacktivists, and then People's Republic of China as well. So just as an example, batteries supply chain is highly dependent battery supply chains are highly dependent on components from the People's Republic of China. Nearly 100% of battery cell material and over 70% of power electronic control systems for batteries are produced in the PRC. And nearly all battery sites in the United States have at least one PRC-made component. Now, at the end of the day, I don't really care so much that all of the battery cells come from China. Obviously, I want those to adhere to manufacturing standards and safety standards, but it's really those power electronic control pieces that I'm concerned about from a cyber perspective. Even of the suppliers that have met approved safety standards or US operational standards, there's still a very high penetration of PRC components. And so why do I care what is actually a supply chain threat? I think that's important to kind of note what those specific concerns are. So we have seen that nation states have demonstrated interest and capabilities in supply chain attacks. SolarWinds is one example. Adversarial nations, and we'll note that SolarWinds has nothing to do with solar or wind, but just the name. So adversarial nations may require organizations headquartered or operating in their countries to follow certain laws. So for example, a 2021 Chinese law requires that any business operating in China report any vulnerabilities to the PRC government before patching or revealing the existence of those vulnerabilities. And from a domestic perspective, what that means is that the Chinese government has vulnerabilities for these devices and these organizations before we would, before anyone is given an opportunity to patch, which is a risk. Even if the companies themselves, the organizations themselves are good actors. There are known ties between PRC executives in these companies and the Chinese Communist Party. It's fairly typical to have people in large companies appointed to government positions or vice versa. We see expanding markets for best suppliers where devices may be white labeled. There's a Canadian inverter company that pretty much just relabels the components that they receive from China and sells them as Canadian goods, and that's not the only example. We're also seeing more vertical integration of these suppliers where it's hard to get, say, a control system that is separated from the battery system. You kind of have to go to the same supplier for all of that. And then, of course, these organizations have legitimate business needs for persistence within the communications networks, whether they're offering services, whether they're collecting data to improve their models, whether they are, maintaining direct access to offer patching or firmware updates. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about what is the supply chain threat for critical infrastructure. And then we can think about vulnerabilities that are kind of non-malicious too, just things that come from an untrusted supply chain where we can't necessarily verify every step of that supply and manufacturing process. And then kind of mentioned this before, but there's a misplaced focus on the origin of battery cells and equipment that doesn't necessarily consider the cyber risks from the power electronics side of the system. So we've done some analysis on what are those actual cyber critical components in battery systems to help identify the dependencies here and where we want to place mitigations. Mentioned this already, but this is a complex ecosystem and a lot of different organizations may have legitimate need to be connected to these sites, but each one of those organizations is a potential access point for a cyber adversary. So really, at the end of the day, we don't expect to change the dependence on a foreign supply chain anytime soon for these types of resources, but we want to be able to operate through this risk and maintain resilience and reliability despite these risks by putting in consequence-based mitigations that focus on procurement, contracting, design, operations, and maintenance of these systems. All right, that was kind of my background risk piece. And let me see. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I will move on to the real world events, which to me is some of the more exciting pieces to kind of see what has actually happened. Oh, I do see a hand up.
Hello, Megan. Thank you for this valuable presentation. This is Mustafa with SPP. My question is related to mitigation strategies. For example, do you want to consider some intrusion detection and anomaly monitoring in the real time for inverter-based resource? Right now, we don't have anything about that. Just we have PRC-281, and it doesn't consider anything for cybersecurity and something like that in the real time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think monitoring is an important part of it. There's also things that we can kind of put in place around earlier phases in the life cycle too. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, the cyber-informed engineering approach. I think it depends on, what you consider to be the highest risks for your organization as to what types of mitigations are going to be the most effective. Generally, monitoring will help with detection, but anything that we can do as a prevention measure so that it never gets to the part where you have to actually detect an adversary in the system is certainly preferable. But we really need all of those stages. We need the prevention piece of it, we need the detection piece, and we need the remediation piece as well of what to do if a cyber event were to occur.
Thank you, Mika.
All right. So, oops. I'm going to go over some recent notable cyber events. This is not a whole list of events, but I think that each one of these that I've selected has some relevance from a grid forming inverters perspective and a different takeaway. So the S-Power denial of service event that occurred in 2019 affected a Utah-based independent power producer that ran some solar and wind resources in Utah. This attack exploited a known vulnerability in a Cisco firewall. This vulnerability forced the firewalls to reboot repeatedly. Each reboot took about 5 minutes, and this continued to occur over a 12-hour period. So it disabled communication to those generation sites, but it did not actually affect the power generation. It's believed that these threat actors may not have even known what devices that they were affecting. They just found an exposed Cisco switch that had a known vulnerability and started exploiting it. So the takeaway here is that effective patch management is key, and limit the exposure of internet-facing devices, as well as to note the prevalence of IT infrastructure in the OT environment. So when we think about managing OT vulnerabilities, we often think about the actual OT devices themselves, the ones that are affecting the physical processes, but really anything that communicates directly with those devices as well, or that we have a dependence on, is important to secure as well. There's been several ransomware attacks on companies that create, operate, or maintain inverter-based resources. I've noted 3 ones that affected large wind companies in Europe. These 3 were notable just because they kind of all occurred within the same 6-month period, although they were not necessarily related. In all 3 of these cases, the group that was affected chose to shut down some of their remote access to the wind assets in order to limit this potential spread of the ransomware. And in none of these cases was there really an operational effect on the wind assets themselves. What I think is important to note here is the dependence on third parties. So in particular, for something like Deutsche Windtechnik, which is a maintenance company, it might not be a big deal to you as an asset owner if that maintenance company is down for 3 days. But if that maintenance company were to be down for 3 weeks or even months, it's important to understand what dependency you have on them and how much reliance you put on having them be able to monitor your systems, so that if they've lost that remote access or chose to cut it off because of a cyber incident, you may have a backup plan in place for how to handle that incident. Ransomware continues to be one of the most prevalent types of cyber incident seen, and even if it doesn't have a direct effect on OT, it typically still affects enterprise systems. It's important to consider the potential cascading effects of the response measures. This is one, so I mentioned those 3 for wind. This is one that happened for solar. This is a solar OEM in Canada. They were hit by ransomware in 2022. What is kind of notable here is we don't usually see the amounts for ransoms posted, so I like to share this. I don't know necessarily if it's representative of most ransoms, but in this case, they demanded 20,000. Oh, and there's a typo there. There's an extra 0. 20,000 to recover the data that had been stolen, 20,000 for the ransomware gang to destroy the stolen data. If they didn't pay that $20,000 ransom, then they threatened to publish the information on the dark web. And then they gave a 3-day deadline to pay the ransom, but they offered an extension of that deadline at a rate of $10,000 a day. So again, I won't claim to say that this is necessarily representative, but it is interesting to take as a case study of the types of ransoms or the different ways that they may set up these ransom agreements. I think we're seeing more and more that this, we're seeing less emphasis on the ability to recover data and more emphasis on the ability to destroy data or to prevent a data leak. Just because more people are getting better at recovering their own data. This Viasat denial of service attack is of interest because it was a nation-state attack on satellite communications in Europe. It was performed in coordination with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And although it was believed that the primary intent was to disrupt Ukrainian military responses, it had the unintended effect of taking out remote monitoring for almost 6,000 Enercon wind turbines in Germany, which represented almost 10 gigawatts of generation capacity. Now, this was just a loss of remote monitoring. The wind continued to produce power, but it did take almost 2 months to bring most of those turbines back online and communicating. So again, that's kind of a long time. This was, again, a nation-state attack. It was fairly destructive in the way that it was executed. Attacking this customer modems or uploading malicious firmware to these customer modems that required physical replacement of these devices. But again, noting this dependence on third parties like communication infrastructure. This March 2023 event was the use of several known vulnerabilities that happened to include a context solar view vulnerability, where the threat actors used these vulnerabilities against devices that were exposed on the public internet to take over the devices and then pretty much turn them into bots that were then tasked to target other targets around the world with denial of service attacks. What's interesting here is just, again, they used that known vulnerabilities and known exploit code to do this, and that there were a lot of these devices that were publicly accessible. And I'm running a little bit short on time. I want to make sure that we get to the cyber-informed engineering piece of this. So this May 2023 attack was interesting because it, again, targeted communication assets. This was vulnerabilities in firewalls that were used to take down those firewalls, essentially, or to turn them into botnets as well. What was interesting here was just the range of responses from different utilities. Some assumed that because this was new equipment, new firewalls, that it was safe. Some assumed that the vendor was responsible for patching, which wasn't true. Some had deliberately opted out of updates because although the firmware was free, the maintenance agreement was not free. And then some didn't even know that they had this exploited device on their system because it was installed by a third party. In one case, it was installed as part of an IP camera setup to segment the IP cameras from the rest of the network. So good on them for segmenting the cameras out from the rest of the OT network. Unfortunately, the firewall that they used was one that did end up having some vulnerabilities that were disclosed. So asset management here is really crucial, and understanding vendor agreements and patching expectations. And then to bring it back around again, a year later, this same context overview vulnerability was used to take over 800 devices in Japan. It used the same vulnerability that had been disclosed in 2022. So it's now been 2 years since that vulnerability was disclosed. These systems are still exposed to the internet, still unpatched. And in this case, they use these devices to commit bank fraud for financial gain. So please apply patches. And especially if there are known exploitable vulnerabilities or known exploited vulnerabilities that have already been exploited by threat actors, those ones are definitely high priority to patch. Let's see. I'm going to skip through these last couple and get to the cyber-informed engineering piece. The takeaways here, there's no notable increase in attacks that are targeting IBRs at large. There is a notable increase in attacks targeting IBRs. We're seeing this trend on the rise, but it's in line with everything else that's going on in the electric in the electric sector. There's no strong evidence that IBRs are targeted specifically because they're IBRs or that people are trying to create operational impact. The vulnerabilities is using on the actual IBR devices is using devices for computing power or to execute other attacks. Ransomware and data breaches continue to be some of the most common attacks, and the most common operational impact that we see is denial of service or denial of view. We do see attacks that are targeting third parties, like the OEMs or the maintenance companies, and so understanding dependence on those third parties is important. And then we do sometimes see that there is reconnaissance activity from advanced persistent threat groups detected before an actual OT event is executed. So looking for those initial signs of compromise can still be important in preventing a larger attack. All right, I'm going to use the last few minutes here to talk about some cyber-informed engineering solutions, and then hopefully leave a few minutes for questions at the end. So if you haven't been exposed to cyber-informed engineering before, really what it's doing is taking a traditional cybersecurity protection mechanism and adding to it engineering controls that are really getting at mitigating the consequences rather than mitigating the likelihood of a successful attack. So if we assume that an attacker does get access to a system and assume that they can execute an attack, what can we design on the engineering side so that even if all of that were to happen, the impact to the system would be mitigated? We focus on a consequence analysis, so looking at the potential impact of the system throughout the life cycle rather than just adding cybersecurity controls and best practices to a design after it's already in progress. And it really focuses on bringing engineers and technicians into the conversation about cybersecurity and not leaving that just up to cyber teams or IT teams. So this culture of security is a key piece of it, and one of the similarities or parallels that can be drawn is to a culture of safety that many organizations have adopted. So where everybody is responsible for safety, everybody is also responsible for security. Cyber-informed engineering is applied throughout a system lifecycle. Typically, OT cybersecurity risk mitigations may not be applied until after a design has already kind of gone through those initial phases. And really what cyber-informed engineering aims to do is make sure that it's included and considered all the way from the requirement stage. There are I think this is 13 cyber-informed engineering principles. I'm not going to walk through each one of them, but they all have a series of questions that you can ask about how to design the system in a way that would align with this principle. So I'm going to walk through an example of what this looks like if we were to apply cyber-informed engineering to a battery system. So first we want to look at what are the consequences of losing that system. And to do that, we first must know what the system is and what the system does. This graph just shows, several of the services that could be provided by a battery system. And then we want to look at what types of engineered controls could we put in place to limit the effect of those consequences if a cyber event were to impact that functionality. So typically, digital controls fall into this engineered or administrative parts of the hierarchy of controls, whereas engineered controls can focus on elimination or substituting risks out at a higher level. What does this look like in practice? One example is the use of a mode key for updating a PLC controller, where you can only make modifications to it if a physical check is in place to make sure that the person there is actually making that change. Another example is this SD card that has a read-write mode versus a read-only mode to prevent modifications to that device later on. Or another example is a phase monitoring relay to put other physical protections in place around the design and not solely rely on the battery monitoring system itself. So as we talked about this, start with what is the system and how is it all interconnected. So here's just a block diagram of what a battery system might look like. Then we want to know, what does this system provide? What functions does it provide? What services does it provide? So we can identify what those services are. We kind of talked about that already. And then we look at how are those services provided through the design of the system. So what we call these are functional threads that trace the operation of a system towards producing a particular service. And there's a couple of those highlighted here. Then we look at what is the consequence if these services were to become unavailable. How severe is that consequence? And is that severity unacceptable? We look at how that consequence would occur from both the engineer's perspective and from the cybersecurity perspective. And then we look at what opportunities for mitigations exist. So things like putting physical controls in at the switch. And we can look at, again, there's a bunch of different questions in the CIE resources for engineered controls, cybersecurity controls, physical security controls, things that address each of those 13 CIE principles. And so then once we have identified where those can be put in place, then they can be added to the system design to create that mitigated plan. All right, that was my very brief dive into CIE, but hopefully it gave you a flavor of that, and I'm happy to provide some more resources if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you have.